This Underpinnings program tonight is kind of a catch-all. It gives you a whole range of sciences which back up God's creation, from fossils, physics, genetics, to the special place this earth has to Babel. So let's get started with this. First, we're going to start with a quick review of what we did last time. The number one way that geologists and archaeologists date a fossil is by what's called index fossils. For example, as I told you last time, this is a trilobite. If it's one species of trilobite, that is said to have only occurred during the Cambrian period, which was somewhere between 500 and 520 million years old, according to secular geology. And so if they find a fossil there, they will automatically date it at 500 to 520 million years, even though radiometric dating may say it's 1.2 billion or 2.3 billion. They will simply ignore the radiometric dating because they know how poor that is. Radiometric dates are often discordant. That is, you can measure a rock via uranium-lead dating, via thorium-lead dating, and perhaps potassium-argon if all six of those elements are in the rock. And guess what? They never agree. And in most cases, they will disagree by billions of years. Paleontologist picks the age via the geologic column. They assume evolution to be true, which is circular reasoning. And as Greg said last time, if you did a paper on that, you'd get an F. As we noted last time, there is nowhere in the world where you can actually see all of these fossils piled one on top of another. It is a construct of the mind that this geologic column occurs. It is assumed to be this way simply because they assume evolution to be true. Here's a chart of these different index fossils that if they find a certain fossil like this, they will believe it was the Devonian period. If they find this fossil, they'll believe it's the Permian. But again, this is assuming that evolution is true and that all these things are stacked up in order in the earth is the way they're supposed to be. And again, nowhere in the earth are they actually stacked like this on top of one another. And again, this is another example that if they find a human skull, they'll date it within the last 2 million years, or if they find a trilobite, it's all the way back to the Cambrian at 500 million. That's how they date most fossils, with an assumption of how old these things are. And again, that highlights the circular reasoning that's involved here. That's very poor logic, very poor. Again, the review of the fact that only in North Dakota have we found a very slim sliver of these things actually in the right order. Everywhere else in the world, what they've done for the rest of the geologic column is taken a piece from Russia, a piece from South America, a piece from Australia, and put them one on top of another with no guarantee that that's the way they're actually supposed to be. Now, all of this stuff we just looked at reminds me of Scripture. 1 Corinthians 2:14, the person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, but considers them foolishness, and cannot understand them because they are discerned only through the Spirit. While a lot of the stuff that we've showed you, I think, violates good science, why do scientists follow it? Again, it's a confused mind. It's a mind that's so devoted to there can't be a God, they will go to ridiculous lengths to ignore his evidence. 1 Corinthians 3, for the wisdom of the world is foolishness in God's sight, as is written, he catches the wise in their craftiness. Yeah, we're so crafty, we talk ourselves into things that aren't there. Now, if the flood occurred, what you would have had was a huge amount of debris, rock, dirt, etc., suspended in water all over the world. Now, what you'll be taught by conventional geologists is that when you get rock strata, it is piled up very slowly over time. What they've done in apparatus like this and then whole room vats is done experiments where they suspended a whole lot of different sized debris from small sand up to rocks in water, moved it along like in a current like you would have had during flood conditions, and see how it settled out. Well, when it settles out, guess what? The bigger, heavier stuff settles on the bottom, then there's the next larger grains, and then the smallest on top. Does it actually make the kind of layering that we see in the rock strata? It does. And this stuff is laid out horizontally across like this and shows that you don't need large period of times to get the rock strata we see in the earth today. It could have all occurred in a very short time via the flood. And Mount St. Helens, which is pictured here, is another example of how that occurred. It not only cut a mini Grand Canyon next to it in a matter of hours, it then laid down strata, just like we see in the Grand Canyon, in just a matter of hours after that. So it does not take millions of years to lay down layers of rock. When scientists do find things that are out of order, which they find all the time, like humans that are too deep or dinosaurs that are too shallow, they will say that it happened because of a discontinuity. They use big words that make people don't want to follow the whole discussion. They will say, well, you had a nonconformity, or you had a thrust where the earth shoved itself down, or one piece shoved itself into another, and that's how that fossil got there. They're having to tell you secondary stories. The simple story is, why is everything mixed in the rock strata? Because that's exactly what we would have expected out of the Noah flood. We would have expected everything died. And yes, are there certain graveyard areas where there's all dinosaurs? Yes, because that was the ecological area that was washed there. Just like, are there other graveyards where we find a whole lot of amphibious creatures? Yes, we do, because that's where that ecological niche was washed to. It depended on where they were. The fantasy of the geologic column, they talk about these discontinuities, which are their secondary stories, and stratigraphic leaks. Notice they never use a four-letter word. They use something big to try and cover the fact that what they're saying is the rock has now repositioned the fossils from where they were. But again, quick sedimentation via catastrophism, the type of things that the Bible talks about, gives us the same type of layers of rock without all these secondary stories, without all these discontinuities. Now, Joe was talking last time about polystrate trees. This is excellent evidence that we find in rock layers all over the world. What are these layers of rock supposed to represent? In conventional geology, that's supposed to be hundreds of millions of years. Do you really believe these trees sat there and grew for hundreds of millions of years, or that after they died, they did not deform in any way and stayed there for hundreds of millions of years while they were covered over? No, this is exceptional evidence that anyone can see that when we see stuff like this, that these things were laid down very rapidly from some type of mud and water deluge. And in point of fact, we see these trees, and this one suspended through multiple layers of rock, as great examples of this world was formed by water and a huge mudslide at one point. Fossils were always Darwin's problem. At the time of the writing of his book, there was not enough real substantiation in the fossil record to support his contentions. But he said in his books, in the next 100 years or so, they'll find all the evidence they need. Well, guess what's happened in the last 150 years? The evidence we have not found because it's not there. Mammoths, the collapse of the water canopy. That is one explanation for finding the woolly mammoths we find well preserved in terms of ice, but also it does not have to be it that way. After the flood, we believe the flood caused an ice age. And could these great creatures, which we find up in Siberia and other northern locales, have simply been caught when the temperature and the climate changed very rapidly after the flood? They very well could have been. This again fits well with a creationist point of view. It does not fit well at all with a conventional point of view. What's really weird about all this stuff is we haven't found a whole lot of giraffes or anything else caught in ice, but again, that's because of where they actually lived. These things lived in a very northern climate, and the amount of mammoths that we've found trapped in ice is rather staggering. Let's go through some basic science. How do you make a fossil? And fossils have soft parts. Now, from the evolutionary point of view, they say something dies, It just lays there on the bottom if it's a fish. If it's a land animal, they say it just lays around until it gets covered over very slowly by dirt, and eventually you make a fossil. Is this what really happens when something dies? For example, somebody tell me that what violates this picture right now. What happens to a fish when it dies? It floats. It floats. And whether it floats or not, whether it's sitting on the bottom or floating on top, it's not going to get the time to be slowly covered over by sedimentation. What's going to occur? I mean, everything sees a free dinner. This is what happens in the real world. In the real world, all the scavengers get a free dinner, and that thing is not going to be fossilized unless it was covered over very rapidly. And even the leftover bones and stuff that float to the bottom, or if it's on land, are laying around afterwards. Do ants and bacteria start attacking it the minute the scavengers are done? Yes, there's almost nothing there in a very short period of time. So this is not a good answer for fossilization. This, in truth, is how we probably got most of the fossils in the world. If there was a flood, you had one happy fish who didn't know what was coming at him, and then suddenly we had all the mud and debris of the flood which occurred. They would be rapidly covered over. That does a lot of things. Number one, it traps that animal to where other animals can't get to it and scavenge it. And second, it freezes out a whole lot of other bacteria and stuff from coming into it, to where it stays basically in that form until fossilization occurs. And what fossilization actually is, folks, is the hard parts of this thing are replaced by minerals. When you find a fossil, it is not the original animal. It is a rock fossil that has minerally replaced the hard parts. What we do also get, though, is impressions of the soft parts, because, again, they were encased in rock. Now, see how nicely this all fits from a creationist point of view. We can't get fossils by just laying around waiting for them to be covered over. But if you start telling stories about, well, the dinosaurs were inundated by the flood, they were killed and rapidly covered over by water, and then rapidly covered over by all the mud and silt that was in the water, and eventually they fossilized down in the rock strata, and today, with erosion, sometimes they get uncovered. Is this a much cleaner, more understandable idea of where fossils come from than the stories the evolutionists tell? Again, this is cleaner science, and it fits within a creationist worldview. Of course, there's other reasons why there might not be things on the side of the road. Any hillbilly will pick up roadkill. What we see, there are two basic stories that the creationist point of view and the secular point of view tell. From this point of view, in the beginning there was no death. Is that creationist or secular? Creationist. And that death is a temporary part of history, and thank the Lord, when he comes back there will be no death. But from a secular point of view, not only is their history stretched out, this one is only several thousand years, this one is millions and millions of years where death has been here from the start, from the beginning, from before Adam, which it really causes huge problems. Why do you need Christ if there was already sin before Adam? It does violence to the gospel of Jesus Christ, and it says death will be with us how long? As long as we're here. It's a very depressing kind of theology, and they wouldn't call it theology, but these are two different worldviews. Now, mutation and adaptation. Gregor Mendel was a monk, and he also liked to grow things. He liked to grow peas and flowers. And he paid special attention to what's in Genesis 1:20 through 24, where it repeatedly says everything was created according to its kind. Genesis 1:21-24. Every living thing with which the waters teem, and every winged bird according to what? Their kinds, according to its kind. Let the land produce every creature according to their kinds, and the livestock creatures that move along the ground and the wild animals, each according to its kind. What Mendel found, and this incidentally was information that was lost for almost 50 years, was he found that there was good substantiation for the idea that everything was according to its kind and it was pre-programmed that way. What he found was if he planted a parent generation of yellow peas and green peas, cross-pollinated those two, what would come up was all yellow peas. Wow. Is that all they'll be forever? No. In the next generation of these cross-pollinated peas, there would be 3 yellows and 1 green. Now, we know today that what he was dealing with was dominant and recessive genes. What he was finding was there was a pre-programming in there to where yellow is the dominant gene. But if you get 2 greens put together from the 2 parents that this one came from, what will you get? You'll get the recessive genes to be expressed in that. This again shows a pre-programming, a preset of instructions that were within there, and he could actually predict generation by generation how many greens, how many yellows would come out. This shows a pre-programming within the cells which no one had paid any attention to. Darwin knew very little of this stuff because, again, until this was rediscovered by a man named de Vries after 1900, this stuff was lost. Nobody knew about this stuff. Now, one of the best examples of mutation and adaptation, and again, I show this as evidence for creation. The evolutionists will try and say this all means that one thing turned into another. Nothing could be further from the truth. But there are great examples out there of how we have pre-programmed into our bodies the ability to adapt. Man's variability. Medieval man was only 5'2". The average height from around 1000 AD to 1500 AD was about 5'2". I'll give you 2 examples of how I know that's true besides just reading in the literature on that. One, has anybody ever gone down to the Alamo and taken a look at the size of the cots in the long barracks? What have you noticed? They're tiny because the average person was short. And we're now only talking what? 170 years ago. The average person was shorter than they are today. You go back 1,000 years, their average was 5'2". What were you going to say, Tracy?
Just the armor.
The armor. If you go over to England, you think, oh, well, they're all just replicas because the armor's this tall. No, that's how tall the people were.
Except for Henry VIII.
Huh? And you see, that's how we get our leaders. George Washington was a great leader, but he was also what? 6'4". Okay? And in a group where everybody is about 5'4", 6'4" stands out. Yeah. So was Saul. He was the tallest of the group until a giant showed up. Yeah. With nutrition today, we're at about 5'8", but we have gotten to the point to where we are getting close to a cap out with that. Is there pre-programming in our cells to allow us to grow to be 15.5 or whatever? It doesn't look like it. It looks like there is an upper bound because of the ratio of our bone structure. Once you get past a certain height, for example, Goliath would have had interesting problems. He may have been a huge person, but when you get up to 9 feet, we deal with this today. There are people in the world today that grow up to near 8 feet. Do they have problems? Yes, they have huge thyroid and musculature problems because of that, because we have a basic design. But today we do see nutrition has pushed us up to about 5'8". That's adaptation. That was what was pre-programmed in the cells, but there's a limit to it. The beet, 1700, the beet only had 6% sugar content. Now, what did we start doing with the beet? They started cross-hybrid production to where they got the sweetest of this crop and the sweetest of this crop and put those seedlings together. By the 18th and 19th century, due to interbreeding, they had gotten that up to 17% sugar, and we now call that a what? A sugar beet, which is what you usually buy in the store. But for the last 150 years, that amount of sugar in them has been frozen because you reached a what? A limit of how far the thing could vary, which was pre-programmed in the cells. Now, if evolution were true, this should not be true. You should be able to just keep varying till it became something completely different. Man should be able to keep growing until he becomes Goliath. There shouldn't be limits on how far we can adapt, but this fits perfectly within a creationist worldview. Now, let's talk about dogs. It is believed that the set of dogs all came from wolves and a progenitor called Tamartus. But what you have is hundreds of species of dogs all over the world, but they're still dogs. The other interesting thing that you find is when you get near them turning into something else, when you get near to the point of they've interbred to the point to where they've become a breed very far apart from the rest of the group, they're non-functional. Let me show you examples of that. Oh, just a side point. Some people will get confused because they'll say species means kind. No, it doesn't. Species, kind in the Bible is probably close to the family or genus location in our own categorization system, but we've got PhDs right now that are working on that because that doesn't even work all the time. Second thing is you cannot determine a kind simply by their chromosome level. For example, a dog has 78 chromosomes, but so does a chicken. And we don't think chickens turned into dogs. That's not even for the secularists. They don't believe in that one. It really boggles us sometimes to look at these different dogs. That a Pekingese or a Shih Tzu, it can be related or can even have offspring with a Great Dane or something like that. But what they are is many species removed from each other, a whole lot of different breeding. Now what we find when we go to the pure breeds, the supposedly good dogs, is we find labs have bone disease, dwarfism, hemophilia, retinal degeneration to the point to where they have blindness problems. What we continually find is when you keep crossbreeding, we are cautioned in the Bible after the time of Moses not to have close relatives interbreed. What do we call that? Incest. Because what you get is bad copies of bad genes which express themselves negatively. Incidentally, is that what we've been doing with dogs for a long period of time? We have. The Great Dane, in that pure breed, the body is too large for its heart and experiences early death, and they have bone cancers. The German Shepherd has dysplasia in its hind legs. They also have a situation in some of them to where their esophagus stops working before age 5. I had a dog that had that, and we had to build a chair for her to where she could sit up like this and lap up her food so gravity would just take it down. Golden Retriever has dysplasia, lymphatic cancer, multiple sclerosis, believe it or not, skin allergies, muscular dystrophy, and some males with only one testicle. That's the guy I feel for. Cocker Spaniel has kidney problems, long ears with frequent infections, hernias, and a nervous habit to bite people, which does not make him popular in a lot of circles. They're pretty. That's a true statement. Irish setters are so dumb they can't find their way to the end of a leash. We breed these things because they look good, but the truth of the matter is, are they very functional? They're not. English bulldogs have such great heads that many pups are often delivered by cesarean section. Do you think that's natural? That they have to be delivered by cutting into them? And they have tight eyelids which damage their sight. This is not what the original dog was programmed to have, these kind of problems. But we've gotten into that because of all of our interbreeding. Yorkies are cataract prone. The collie has eye diseases and skin conditions. Shelties have skin lesions and a bad immune system. What's the healthiest dog in the world? A mutt. You can't get rid of them. They'll live forever. They may live to 17 or whatever else like that, and they're usually happy and that kind of stuff. And they don't have all the problems because all of these dogs, these pure breeds that we're talking about, have they gotten near the edge of what the pre-programming would allow them to adapt. This is exactly what the creationists would expect because we believe that these things were programmed with a certain amount of variability but no more. If evolution were true, what should we see with all these special kinds? We should see them just keep developing in that direction, but they don't. They don't. What about antibiotic resistance? You've heard that antibiotic resistance is proof of evolution. It doesn't prove that mutation can evolve a species. And what we have is before antibiotics, you had all these bacteria,
after antibiotics, it kills off all except for the ones resistant to it. And one of the biggest problems we have in medicine today is people don't finish their trail of antibiotics. They will be given a 10-day regimen, and they feel better after 5 or 6, so what do? They quit taking it, which means the ones that are most resistant are not killed off, and that's all you have in the future is ones that are resistant. But notice that those that weren't resistant were there from the start. Hey kid, want to be a superbug? Stick some of this in your genome. Even penicillin won't be able to harm you. It was a shortcut to the hospital kitchens that Albert was first approached by a member of the antibiotic resistance. Folks, this is a cartoon, but you're going to be amazed to find out how close this is to the truth. And it hits the front page today. What's happened just this past week at 2 hospitals in L.A.? They've had huge problems with what are called superbugs. I will describe to you what a superbug is. They're not that super. It is common thought that a bacteria develops a resistance to antibiotics. It's also thought that insects develop a resistance to pesticides. Both of those thoughts are untrue. And insects develop a resistance to pesticides. In truth, all that occurs is that the only organisms that survive are naturally resistant by chance variation. In other words, there is no new information created in genomes to resist antibiotics or to resist pesticides. It's just all the bugs or bacteria are killed off by these chemicals that are not resistant to it, and all that's left is the ones that are what? Naturally resistant. Now let me show you how we know this. And of course, if they're the only ones who live after the injection of penicillin or whatever, they're the only ones that reproduce. These are some graves in the Arctic of the Franklin expedition, which occurred over 150 years ago. This was a tragic expedition that was supposed to go to the North Pole. None of them ever returned. Their graves were found in the last 60 years, and an interesting thing was found. Some of the bacteria in these guys' bodies and in their clothing, etc., when revived, had resistance to modern antibiotics. The scientists at the University of Alberta revived the bacteria from members of the Franklin expedition who perished over 150 years ago. Some of the bacteria were resistant to antibiotics such as clindamycin and sulfoxidin. Now, through the way people think of it today, they would have said, okay, well, they got this resistance because they didn't finish their antibiotics. No, this was before antibiotics were ever invented. And yet these bacteria were resistant to us, showing us that that resistance was there from the beginning. And again, both of these antibiotics were developed more than a century after these men died. So it couldn't have been through the way. Yeah, they were trying to make it. They got caught in winter storms. They actually separated. The burial plot I showed you is where a group of, if I remember correctly, 5 or 6 died. They buried them and they went on towards the North Pole, and the rest of the group died getting there. They never returned. But we found these bodies and found this antibiotic resistance that should. In other words, the bacteria have inherited resistance. They did not die from the bacteria. They died from the cold. The information for resistance is already in the genes. When antibiotics are used in such instances, the non-resistant bacteria die, leaving resistant ones. Now, the bacteria muddle this story, though. Some bacteria directly transfer their resistance to others. A process in bacteria in which a loop of DNA information called a plasmid is transferred from one bacterium to another occurs. They can actually copy a piece of their DNA, send it out, and it's caught by another bacteria and included in their DNA. We don't do that. Animals and plants don't do that. But bacteria do that, which is why they can change so rapidly. Now, this is a fairly random process. Do they always send the piece of loop that makes them resistant? No, they don't. They send random pieces of loop, just like they're getting rid of excrement or whatever, into the environment, and some bacteria pick up on it, and some of them gain that. This is why researchers love to work with bacteria. Not only do they change rapidly, they don't live long. What's the average lifespan of a bacteria? Hours. Hours or days. And so in a week, they can go through multiple generations of change and adaptation and mutation. So they love to do that. And then what they do is they look at those results and say, ooh, this is what happens to humans. No, it's not. We don't have plasmid transfer, and we don't live 6 hours and die. So when they try to extrapolate what they see with bacteria to a trillion-cell organism, that is a very bad extrapolation. Thus, information that enables bacteria to become resistant to a substance can be transferred to a non-resistant organism. So that's why they can pick up this kind of resistance rather rapidly. However, the information for that resistance already existed. There's no new information arose from matter. Information in this instance is just transferred around. Again, this is what we would expect from the creationist point of view, and it's not what's being let out to the public that somehow they're developing their own resistance. No information gaining mechanism is needed for molecules to man evolution. Another example of this is in the Carlsbad Caverns. They just found a new set of caves in the Carlsbad, the Gula Gila Cave in New Mexico. There was never any human contact, or at least in recorded history. So maybe there was 150, 200 years ago, but we don't have records of that. But they found multiple strains of bacteria with immunity to almost all of our current antibiotics, again indicating that this is resistance that was already there, pre-programmed into this bacteria. Now, there are a number of instances of bacteria becoming resistant through mutations, inherited copying mistakes. But when examined closely, all such mutations appear to be losses of information. Probably the best known of the antibiotic-resistant ones is MRSA. That's methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. And what it is supposedly a superbug. Where is 99.9% of all the MRSA in the world? It's in hospitals, and that's a bad place for it to be. The reason it's in hospitals and not out in the general public is because it can't survive in the environment. It is a damaged form of a bacteria to where all it can do, it has a good form of resistance. It can resist antibiotics except for 2, and it can resist antiseptics except for a couple. So they have trouble getting rid of this stuff in a hospital setting. If you take this MRSA and put it in a petri dish with bacteria like itself that are not MRSA, they will outcompete it for food, and the MRSA will die off in that petri dish within a couple hours. Because it is defective bacteria. It cannot survive. If you, in point of fact, I'm going to tell you right now that most of you, this is going to be a bad thought, most of you probably have a MRSA germ or 2 on your skin right now. That made Austin scratch. But they test you for it when you go in the hospital. Here's the good news. If you do not have a compromised immune system, your body simply throws off the MRSA on a regular basis daily. But what's the truth about people in the hospital? They're there because they're sick and they have compromised immune systems. Now you get a bug, even though this is not a strong bug. Calling them a super bug is a misnomer. They're really an idiot bug. But you get one of those bugs into you and it doesn't respond to antibiotics. Can a sick person have a problem? They can have a huge problem. Conclusions. Mutations are a loss of information, as we've seen with MRSA. They're not getting better. They're not becoming superbugs. They're becoming idiot bugs. Mutations do not give rise to new species. And the kinds of species are fixed, even though there is a whole lot of variability, as we've seen in bacteria, dogs, humans, and the sugar beet.
Isn't it true that these specialized dogs or whatever, plant, wheat, whatever, that if left alone, they revert back to a more natural state?
In most cases, they will try to revert back, but one of the problems that happens when you have pushed the variation as far as a special breeding is they actually lose information to be able to go back there. Now, if they can crossbreed with something else that has their missing genetic code, that can be reintroduced to the species. But it depends on how far they've buried. Now, I'm going to cover this real quickly. We covered this in session 2, but it's good stuff to show you that physics supports creation. The first law of thermodynamics, matter is neither created nor destroyed by normal chemical means. Stuff does not just pop into existence. That seems common sense, except what does the Big Bang say? Everything in the entire universe popped into existence in one instant. It's nuts. Second law of thermodynamics, entropy. Everything is winding down, becoming more disorganized. And we see that every day. Your cars, do they last forever or will they eventually die and rust out? Everything is wearing out. The first law of thermodynamics again says that matter is not just popping into existence. They used to believe in what's called spontaneous generation, that if you had a lot of mud and some water together, it made a frog. No, the frogs went and deposited the tadpoles and all that kind of stuff, and it was biogenesis, not abiogenesis, which means that life is coming from non-life, which has never been observed. What we observe is what the Bible states, that life will always produce according to its kind. They used to say that if you got a whole lot of trash in the side of a barn, it would produce a mouse. No, it's not the trash that produces a mouse, it's the trash that attracts a mouse. But again, prior to Reddy and Pasteur, who did great experiments on this, they didn't know these things. These are the experiments of Reddy, who went in and closed off some meat from flies and then left another beaker open to where the flies could get in here. What eventually showed up in the meat of these open beakers? Larvae, we call them maggots, yeah. Whereas no maggots showed up in here. This was a great experiment by Reddy to show that because one of the other superstitions they used to have was meat would make maggots. No, meat didn't make maggots. It attracted the flies that deposited eggs that made larvae and maggots. Jablot's experiment demonstrated the same thing both with meat and with covered dishes, that if you heated them and covered them, nothing would grow in them, but if you heated them and uncovered them, guess what? You would produce all sorts of stuff because bacteria would get into that uncovered thing. Again, life only comes from life. First law of thermodynamics, again, matter doesn't just pop into existence. But the Big Bang, and before the Big Bang, they used to have an idea called the steady state theory, which said somewhere out there in space it's real different and hydrogen molecules are just popping into existence all the time. Again, does that violate the first law of thermodynamics? Yes. Evolution is contrary to the first law. In Psalms, it said, he established them forever and ever. He has made a decree they shall not pass away. It is a believer in the fact that whatever's made is what's made forever. That new stuff is not popping into existence. That which has been is what will be, not new stuff. And there's nothing new under the sun. 2 Peter, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. Again, the Bible is a deep believer in that things just aren't popping into existence. It believes that everything was created in the beginning, and that's all there is. But evolution says, no, new stuff can just pop into existence. And, of course, their big example is the Big Bang, in which they think a Big Bang occurred, and then it created solar systems and stars and planets, and then on those planets you actually had the formation of environments. We're going to get past the first law. Biogenesis we've talked about at length. Life only comes from life. Whereas abiogenesis, what evolution is based on, believes at some point non-life turned into living material. That has never been observed, and science is supposed to be about what we observe. Second law of thermodynamics, everything is winding down. Randomness becomes corruption, as the Bible calls it. And there's a debate about closed and open systems. the evolutionists will acknowledge, okay, everything is winding down, but the earth is exempted from that because we're getting energy from the sun, and that's replenishing us to where things don't wear down on earth. I beg to differ. Do we see everything winding down on this planet? We do. We are not exempt from the second law of thermodynamics. I gave you the example earlier of my son. With great effort, we'll keep his room straight, but if there's no effort, what do we get? His room in its natural habitat. This garden, did that happen by accident, or does this show a whole lot of work? Whole lot of work. Because if you leave an area to itself, will it totally degrade? It will totally degrade. You can get this in a relatively short period of time. And again, my cars analogies. Why do we have so many junkyards? Because everything is wearing out. So does this whole idea of everything getting more and more organized, as evolution would tell it, is that working in the right direction or the wrong direction? The wrong direction. What God said was he created everything and put organization there to start with, and from the time of the fall, what's been happening to everything? It's been degrading. Whereas evolution says everything is getting better. Everything is getting more complex. That's not what we observe in nature.
So even the mutations that we see in our genes for, like sickle cell,
Mm-hmm. That's what are you going to?
adaptation?
That's not an adaptation. That's a degradation. That's losing information. Is sickle cell anemia something we want to have?
No, but if you have this one trait, you're somewhat protected against malaria.
Ah, that's a true statement. But let's look at the whole of that. It protects me against malaria by accident, okay? But if I now marry another person with that sickle cell mutation, we will have kids that have sickle cell anemia. Do I really think that that is pushing me forward? No. It's a trade-off for one or the other, and you're right, it does come by mutation. But it again shows how this is lack of information. True positive information would make me what? Immune to malaria, but at the same time would not produce that negative side effect. This is not true positive information. And of course, the Bible believes in everything's wearing out. In Genesis, it says everything from the time of the curse was, the ground was cursed. Everything was cursed from the time of our fall. Romans, the creation was subjected to futility because the creation itself will also be delivered from the bondage of corruption. Corruption means it's wearing out, wearing down. Psalms 102, yes, all of them will grow old like a garment. And it's talking here about what? The heavens and the earth. Everything is subject to the second law. Creationists believe in the second law. We think that's what we observe in nature, but evolutionists try to sidestep that because it destroys the evolutionary concept. The law of cause and effect, the principle that nothing can happen without being caused. Plato proposed this in 360 BC. Out of this came Aristotle's idea of the unmoved first mover. This is actually a logic test to show that there has to be a God. Because everything we see in the world happens because something else happened. If this rock right here gets moved over there, do I think it got up and moved itself? No, it got kicked, it got moved by wind, it got pushed by water, something moved it. And going back to the original creation, what logic says was there was an original unmoved first mover. What would be the name of that original unmoved first mover? God himself. The Creator. But according to the Bible, sin has consequences, and that has kind of derailed us from all this. Now let me quickly go over these four things in physics and logic that we've looked at. First and second law of thermodynamics, the law of cause and effect, and biogenesis. Creation believes in the first law. Evolution says no, things can just pop into existence. Creation says everything's wearing out. Evolution tells us, no, everything's wearing up. That's not what we observe. Creation says there is a cause and effect for everything. We sinned in the garden, we got kicked out. God got tired of us. He brought a flood. There's a cause and effect relationship demonstrated in the Bible, and yet evolution says, no, there's no cause or effect for anything. It's all just random. Biogenesis. According to the creationists, everything is produced according to its kind. Life always comes from life, which is what Pasteur demonstrated over 200 years ago. But the evolutionists say sometime in history, non-life became life. Has that ever been observed in nature? Never. Astrophysics made simple. That don't look simple, but what we're going to get into is how special this place is. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Did he or did it all create itself by blind chance and the law of physics? How did the universe violate the first law of thermodynamics just to get started? That's a great question. Could the world form without God's help? This is a professor named Harold Schlusser out of the University of Texas, El Paso. Dr. Schlusser at UTEP, when he was teaching, he would give his freshman physics students a problem each year. The first problem he would give them was they are to compare the vapor pressure of hydrogen gas against the gravitational attraction of hydrogen atoms. Now, when they do this, they found out something interesting. The result, the vapor pressure forcing the molecules apart, is 40 times greater than their gravitational attraction. Question, if this is true, and hydrogen atoms just floating around in space force themselves apart 40 times greater than they're attracted to each other, how could you ever get the formation of little things to turn into planets and to asteroids and to stars if the molecules themselves are forcing them apart greater than the gravitational attraction is pulling them together? It's a great question. They cannot simply happen together. They must be forced together. And this is the thesis for all the creation that comes out of the Big Bang model, that all of this stuff is somehow forced together. This is the real problem for astrophysicists who maintain that our sun and planets are simply a congealing of dust and gas. Problem is, dust and gas won't congeal. They will separate themselves. The physics says they could not congeal together. No theory which works for the inner planet also explains the outer planet. This is great stuff. They have a lot of theories for where Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars came from, the rocky planets. And they have a lot of theories for where the gas giants came from. Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. But all of the theories that work for the outer planets do not work for the inner planets. And all the other 50-some-odd theories that work for the inner planets do not work for the outer planets. So we've got hundreds of theories out there, folks. None of them work. You know what works? God created it. To get stars, you need stars. There are 5 theories on how gases could be forced together to get stars. Again, you have to do what to the gas? Force it together. Among them are the explosion of supernova and formation of other stars. In other words, if you have an explosion somewhere, it will force gas together, but you all first have to have a star to explode. You have to have a star before you can get a star. That don't work. But all of these theories require stars to be present to form other stars. You can't get it unless God said, I'm going to form it. There was an outside source to form all this. There hasn't been any theory for how the original stars came to be until the tooth theory of dark matter came along. Dark matter supposedly inhabits the bulk of our universe. We have never seen it. We cannot tell you what it looks like, how it behaves, nor what its properties are, and yet we're crediting it for creating stars and holding galaxies together. The original reason they theorized that there was dark matter and dark energy was they noticed galaxies do not rotate according to Einsteinian physics. And so what they said was there must be more matter there, and so they invented matter. When you take 96% for both dark matter and dark energy is part of the total universe. Only 4% for real matter and for the energy that we use. Now this Earth is a very special kind of place. We live within what's called the galactic halo zone. We live between the spiral arms in the Milky Way galaxy. If we lived right here in the middle where we think there's a black hole, we would be sucked in. If we live on the event, outside the event horizon for that, there'd be huge radiation and projectiles following us, making this a very bad place to live. If we lived in one of the spiral arms, we would again be subjected to higher radiation and a whole lot of asteroids and other things that are frequented in that area because it's so dense that it would be difficult for us to live. But one other thing. Because we live between these spiral arms, we can see out in multiple directions, and our position in the universe actually allows us to look at God's creation in a very free way. You think that's accidental? An almost perfectly circular orbit. You think that's accidental? We are protected by the gas giants. 20 years ago, there was a huge comet which basically broke apart and hit Jupiter. It was called Shoemaker-Levy. This is not the first time that debris coming in from the outside part of the solar system or outside our solar system has been gobbled up by the orbits of these gas giants. They actually protect us from a whole lot of debris coming in. Again, we have that nearly circular orbit, because if we did not have a circular orbit, what would happen if we got very close to the sun occasionally? We'd fly. And then what would happen when we go out a long way from the sun? We'd freeze. Again, we have winter and summer, but it's nothing compared to what we would experience if we did not have a circular orbit. We have an oxygen-rich atmosphere, but it's not pure oxygen. You don't want pure oxygen. If we had pure oxygen and I lit a match, what would happen? Everybody in the room's gone. That's what happened in Apollo 1. That's why we lost Grissom, Chaffee, and White on Apollo 1. Correct mass to hold the atmosphere, but not to give a crushing gravity. If we were a smaller planet like Mars, Mars lost its atmosphere. We have to have enough mass to hold the atmosphere, but we don't want so much mass like Jupiter to where we would be crushed against the ground because of the huge gravity.
But Mars also does not have a magnetic field.
It actually,
A real north-south pole, so you don't have the same type of protection that we do with the magnetic field around.
it does have a magnetic field, but much weaker than ours. Much weaker than ours. And incidentally, I can't go through a magnetic field. That's a whole different set of evidence, but I'm going to give you a way to get that. We are orbited by a large moon, giving us a stable climate, holding our 23.5 degree tilt, which mixes water and tides. That moon does several things for us. It mixes the water in the oceans by tides. It causes tides. And second, it holds our 23.5 degree tilt, which is really where our seasons come from, folks. Our seasons are not, we're closer to the sun during the summer and we're farther away during the winter, because what happens is actually we're getting more sunlight when we're tilted towards the sun and what? Less sunlight when we're tilted away. That's where seasons come from. And is our ecosystems balanced on these seasons? Yes. There is supposed to be a life and death process that goes on during those times. Plate tectonics. The Earth actually mixes itself. We have active plate tectonics. If we had a dead planet, we couldn't survive on it. This allows volcanically active planets to exist in a stable fashion. The ratio of liquid water and the amount of land mass is optimal for supporting life on land. If this was water world, would we exist? No, there might be aquatic creatures, but not us. What if it was desert planet? You wouldn't have life, because most life is built with water. It's a terrestrial planet. It recycles itself. It's amazing how well this thing is designed. It has a moderate rate of rotation. What if the Earth was spinning 3 or 4 times faster than it is now? We might fly off of it, but also it would be pancake shaped. Okay? So we have a very special rate of rotation. And there had to be some way to force matter together, because again, the laws of physics say this world should have never been formed. It's the right size planet. Again, I'd already made those points about Mars, but I will add that we need the magnetic field that you were talking about, because that magnetic field protects us from a lot of the radiation coming at us. The chance of all these things I pointed up about the Earth happening by accident or 1 quadrillion to 1 according to Guillermo Gonzalez, a PhD, and an astronomer. We may be alone in the universe, yet we are told by scientists, well, there must be thousands, tens of thousands of Earths out there. Guess what? We've been looking at a lot of exoplanets over the past 20 years. Have we found another Earth yet? No. We're not finding another star like ours, and we're not finding another perfect place in another perfect planet in a perfect place like ours. Just Lucker was a design. It looks designed. If you want to see more on this, there's a video I have over there called The Privileged Planet, which was put together by Dr. Gonzalez and by the Discovery Institute. It goes into all the material I talked about a very special Earth, and a whole lot more, including a whole lot about magnetic fields. For thus saith the Lord that he created the heavens, God himself had formed the earth and made it. He has established it not in vain. He formed it to be inhabited. Is this what we find when we look at the science? That this is a very special place designed for us. And it's exactly what Scripture says. I am the Lord and there is none else. And again, that there are around the world these ziggurats. Now the question is Babel just a fable or is it the truth? Now in Iraq we find a ziggurat at Ur. We also find the Mayan ziggurat at Chichen Itza. Is it just an accident that these two are the same type of construction, or does it show a memory of a certain construction in the past? Incidentally, we don't know that Babel was a ziggurat construction. But I just find it interesting that we find all of these ziggurats across the planet in very different cultures. This is one artist's conception of Babel as it was being built. Incidentally, do you know that Atlantis in Genesis is building a full-size Babel base along with a full-size ark in northern Kentucky to open in 2 years? What happened at Babel, supposedly? According to the Bible, people had problems together. They had decided they were God. They could build anything. God had told them to do what? Disperse. Go fill the earth. But they said, nah, God, we're going to stay together, and we're going to build a temple to ourselves, to you. And God said, no, you're not. I told you to disperse, and if you won't do it kindly, I'm going to force you to. And he gave them all different languages. And what happens when you can't communicate with another person? You disperse. So he forced them apart. Now, interesting from linguistics, if you read the Bible and read the people groups that come out of Babel, that accounts for more than 78 people and language groups. Linguists today suggest our current languages came from 50 or more language families. Now that shows that the biblical account is in good accord with what we see today. The languages we see today come out of 50 language groups. There were more than 50 at Babel, but some of them have become dead languages since then. They no longer carry forward. So this fits right within what the Bible says and what we find in linguistics. As I've told you before, when you start taking a look at the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, it supports Babel greatly. These people down here will claim in their ancient records that they are Cushites because who inhabited the place first? Cush. Nushas up here, in fact, Moscow was first called Nushas because he was the first person to inhabit that area. Nushas, as told by their records, their secular records, and also by the Bible, and this could go on and on. The red record of the Delaware Indians, also known as the Wallam Ulam, the Lanai Lenape people, which meant original people, they have records of their going where? Tell of a creation account in the history of the Indian crossing of Asia after Babel and the buried land bridge in North America. This is a record from almost 4,000 years ago. This, again, is a culture which says Babel occurred and we were pushed out. They didn't call it Babel, but they describe exactly what we would expect from Babel. Now let's go to China. China, 4,500 years ago, to migrate, they made up a symbol that was made out of a great walk from the west, and now we stop here. Where is China compared to Eden? They walk from the west. West is one man and enclosure. That enclosure is the same thing they use for the garden. If you put together tongue with a leg that moved out, you get what? Confusion. Or confusion is the tongue with a secondary meaning for leg is mystery. Was it a mystery to them what the other guy was saying after the confusion? It certainly was. Scatter or disperse in Chinese is all flesh or families followed out. Tower is an undertaking united. Is that what they were doing with the Tower of Babel? Everyone is getting together to build this tower for themselves. All united, join hands is the cover. A tower is dust, glass. Incidentally, is that how you make bricks? Mm-hmm. Yeah, with glass and stuff like that. People all under one into one mouth. This may refer to the Tower of Babel since the Chinese did not build towers or pagodas until the Buddhist era around 500 BC. These words were formed in 4500 BC, more than 2,000 years earlier, and it shows great evidence that they knew of the transition from Babel. Language stats, and I'm almost done. There are 6,900 spoken languages in the world today. That boggles the mind. The Bible says there were probably less than 100 from Babel. The linguists are in good agreement. They say that from that time there was probably around 94 at the start. The dispersion occurred as the Bible described. We see good circumstantial evidence for that. Why not if for the confusion event? The current rate of variation, that is, one language will vary into another. Do we have a dialect now here in South Texas called Tex-Mex? We do, which is not Castilian Spanish. And the development of these 6,900 languages from 94, if we just go the current amount of variation from the 94 that they started with, we should get somewhere between 4,500 and 5,500 languages today. Is that very consistent with what's actually here? Yes, it is. It fits well within a creationist worldview and within a linguistic worldview. The oldest languages are not primitive. When we start looking at Egyptian hieroglyphs and things of that nature, there are no grunts. If you're following the evolutionary point of view, what should have been the first language? We should have had all that done. What we find is syntax and grammar that's far in excess of what we have today. We find that our current languages are what? Decayed, getting worse, not getting more complex. This is what the Bible would predict. This is what we find in geology and archaeology. There are no primitive languages. Does Ziggurat exist? Maybe that's what the Bible looked like, maybe not. The language evidence coincides with what we would expect from Babel. The table of nations can be verified and shows that a dispersion occurred. The question is, why did it occur? It fits right within the biblical framework. The dispersion occurred as the Bible described. Again, good verification. Why would they move out if a confusion event did not occur? And this all makes a what? Good circumstantial case. Am I showing you where Babel was? No. Got no clue. But the truth of the matter is, we have a good case for it. But I want to go back to that last thing, faith. Is there still a faith component in all this? What I'm going to do at the end of all of these sessions is ask you, which does it take more faith to believe in? Evolution or Christianity? Christianity has a faith component to it, folks. But what you should be seeing along the way is you're going to have to discard Christianity and have a huge amount of blind faith to believe in what? To believe in the evolutionary story.